The official books declared this massive naval fighter impossible to fix, but one wrench-turning Marine dared to break every rule and unlock its deadly potential. February 14th, 1943. The time is 1:14 p.m. at 20,000 feet above the crucial island of Guadalcanal. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh fought desperately to control his F4U Corsair, wrenching the stick to the port side, striving to maintain proximity with the agile Japanese Zero he was pursuing. Yet again, the enemy fighters sliced effortlessly into a tighter arc, cutting inside Walsh's trajectory. Walsh hauled back on the stick with every ounce of strength he possessed. The world began to gray at the edges of his vision. Blood pooled away from his brain. 4Gs, 5Gs, 6Gs. Despite the crushing pressure, the Zero continued to turn with superior grace, tightening its spiral. Walsh's wingman, Second Lieutenant Howard Finn, suddenly erupted over the radio, the sound sharp with panic. Break right, break right. He's tracking you. But Walsh was utterly committed. He could not disengage. To break off the turn now meant presenting the Zero with a clean, fatal shot at his 6 o'clock. The statistics filtering back from the early months of 1943 were sobering, even devastating. During the first 30 days, the Corsair saw serious action. Marine Corps aviators did claim 47 confirmed aerial victories. These were certainly impressive figures, proof of the Corsair's sheer speed and formidable firepower. Yet beneath the headlines, a critical flaw was costing lives. American pilots were consistently losing turning dogfights to the A6M0 at altitudes below 10,000 feet. The issue wasn't a deficit in pilot skill, nor lack of courage. It was a fundamental, unyielding constraint of physics and engineering. The F4U Corsair, touted as America's latest fighting machine, boasted a monumental 2,000 horsepower engine and heavy-hitting 50 caliber machine guns. It could outpace any Zero by more than 40 miles per hour. It could dive away from any engagement the Japanese dared to initiate. But when the fight demanded sustained low-speed maneuvering, when victory or death hinged on how sharply the plane could pivot, it consistently failed. VMF 124, the very first Marine squadron to field the Corsairs in combat, documented a profoundly troubling pattern. At lower airspeeds, precisely during those critical wheeling, turning fights where air superiority was earned or lost, the Corsair's massive propeller, 13 feet 4 inches across, suddenly became a debilitating liability. The raw, enormous torque generated by the engine forced the pilots into an exhausting physical struggle against their own airframe just to maintain a level flight path. In the initial 6 weeks of deployment, VMF 124 suffered the loss of 8 Corsairs. These aircraft were not primarily falling victim to superior Japanese tactics or piloting, but to the inherent self-defeating handling characteristics of the Corsair itself. Major William Geese, the squadron commander, formalized the grim findings in his combat assessment. The aircraft possesses inadequate control authority at low speeds. Our pilots cannot execute coordinated flight maneuvers during maximum G turns. We urgently require an immediate engineering solution before we sustain further casualties. The response from Vought aircraft engineers was both immediate and unhelpful. They replied by memorandum stating firmly, the propeller governor is calibrated strictly to factory specifications. Any modifications undertaken in the field would automatically invalidate the airframe's certification. Request for field modification is categorically denied. What those distant engineers in Connecticut failed to grasp was that 7,000 miles away on a primitive waterlogged airstrip in the Solomon Islands, a 23-year-old Marine mechanic, armed with little more than a high school education, was preparing to disregard every single edict and regulation printed in the technical manual. His name was Technical Sergeant James "Jimmy" Nagel. A native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, he was a former neighborhood garage mechanic who had signed up 2 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He possessed exactly 0 engineering degrees and 0 formal aeronautical design training. Yet in less than 72 hours, his forbidden adjustment would transform the F4U Corsair from a deeply troubled, pilot-killing fighter into the most feared and lethal aerial weapon in the entire Pacific theater. The Japanese pilots facing this suddenly maneuverable monster would eventually name it Shino Fukia. the death whistle. American pilots, whose lives were now being saved, simply called it the plane that brought them home. The issue of Allied fighters failing to match Japanese maneuverability had plagued the war effort since 1942. Japan's primary carrier fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M0, dominated the Pacific skies through sheer overwhelming agility. At combat velocities below 250 miles per hour, the Zero could effortlessly sustain turns approaching 7 Gs with a remarkably tight turning radius of only 630 feet. American fighters, the early P-40S, the Grumman F-4F Wildcats, and the initial production Corsairs simply could not emulate this performance without immediately entering an unrecoverable stall or spin. The fundamental physics governing the combat was brutally simple and inescapable. The Zero weighed a mere 5,300 pounds, fully loaded. The Corsair weighed a monstrous 12,100 pounds. As Sir Isaac Newton famously dictated, the laws of motion are not open to negotiation, especially when concerning inertia and mass. By February 1943, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had exhausted nearly every tactical countermeasure. They implemented the thatch-weave defense formation and perfected boom-and-zoom hit-and-run attacks, always leveraging the Corsair's superior speed and altitude advantage. While these tactics helped mitigate the danger, they did not address the root problem. When American pilots were involuntarily forced into a sustained turning dogfight, the result was almost invariably fatal. Equipment-based solutions were also proposed: longer wingspans for increased lift, larger control surfaces for greater authority. But the process of redesigning and retrofitting an aircraft fleet required years of development and the expenditure of millions of dollars. Time and money were luxuries the pilots losing their lives in the Solomons did not possess. The final category of solution focused on the pilots themselves. Train better, fly smarter, and absolutely avoid low-sped turning engagements. But warfare is inherently chaotic. Combat scenarios rarely align with sanitized training drills. Zeros possess the ability to dictate the terms of engagement, forcing the heavier American fighters directly into their killing zone, a slow, desperate wheeling confrontation. The prevailing consensus among the world's most distinguished aviation experts was uniform and discouraging. You cannot compel a 12,000-pound fighter to turn with the same agility as a 5,000-pound fighter. It is a mathematical impossibility. Dr. Theodore von Karman, the globally recognized director of the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory, articulated the scientific barrier plainly. He argued that the Corsair's tremendous power-to-weight ratio was specifically designed for high-speed engagement and altitude performance. Attempting to modify its low-speed handling without executing a complete costly airframe redesign would inevitably compromise the aircraft's structural integrity. We could not violate the immutable laws of physics, he stated. The Navy's powerful Bureau of Aeronautics concurred completely. An internal memorandum circulated on January 28, 1943, reiterated the policy. F4U propeller governor settings are optimized for the aircraft's full operational performance envelope. Field adjustments are strictly prohibited. Repeat, field adjustments are prohibited. The stakes could not have been higher. The F4U Corsair represented America's billion-dollar investment in securing victory in the Pacific Air Campaign. 12,000 units were already on order, with hundreds of millions sunk into development costs. If the Corsair could not effectively engage and survive turning combat against the Zero, the entire program, and potentially the regional strategic balance, was fundamentally compromised. Meanwhile, Japan's aerial strategy was rapidly adapting. Imperial Navy commanders had quickly acknowledged that the Corsair's exceptional speed made boom and zoom attacks almost impossible to defend against. They countered by altering their tactics. They would bait and force the Corsairs into slow-speed turning engagements, where the Zero still maintained an overwhelming, deadly dominance. Saburo Sakai, the legendary Japanese ace, chillingly recorded the strategy in his personal diary. The new American fighter is very fast but maneuvers sluggishly at lower speeds. We intentionally draw them into slow turns. They follow because they are brave, but then we execute the kill. The statistics validated Sakai's observation. In the 31 days between February 12th and March 15, 1943, VMF 124 lost 8 Corsairs in combat operations. Critically, 6 of those losses were documented as occurring during prolonged, low-sped turning fights. The squadron's overall kill ratio, which typically favored American airframes heavily, plummeted to a dangerous 3-to-1 whenever the Corsairs were forced to fight below 200 miles per hour. Marine pilots were keenly aware of the rigid restrictions imposed upon them. Briefings emphasized strict adherence. Always maintain maximum speed. Never under any circumstances engage in a turning fight with a zero. If forced to slow, immediately execute a high-speed dive and escape. But war is defined by chaos, not checklists. Escorts became separated in cloud cover. Fuel reserves dropped to critical levels. Damage sustained during an initial pass meant an aircraft could no longer maintain high speed. When these unavoidable circumstances occurred, the pilots were left with absolutely no viable tactical options. First Lieutenant Frank Baldwin of VMF 124 poured out his frustrations in a letter home on March 10, 1943. The Corsair is an absolute beast. It is powerful, brutally fast, and heavily armed, but it violently resists your every input in a tight turn. The rudder freezes up, the nose suddenly drops, and you are literally wrestling against the laws of physics while a zero calmly maneuvers inside your turning circle and puts rounds right into your tail. We have lost excellent men who did everything exactly right. The problem isn't with us, it's with the plane. That letter arrived at Baldwin's family residence 3 weeks following his death. He was shot down on March 18, 1943, during a turning engagement with 3 zeros at 8,000 feet. The eventual solution would emerge from the most improbable location, a cramped, canvas-covered maintenance tent situated at Henderson Field. There, a young technical sergeant from Pittsburgh was about to commit an act that Navy regulations formally classified as unauthorized modification of government property. What those voluminous regulations failed to account for was that sometimes unauthorized modifications possess the power to definitively win wars. James Patrick Nagel had absolutely no inherent business working on sophisticated naval aircraft propulsion systems. Born November 3, 1919 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Jimmy grew up immersed in a working-class environment where higher education was rare and working with one's hands was the only path. His father owned and operated a local auto garage. Jimmy learned the intricate mechanics of fixing cars long before he mastered algebra. He chose to drop out of high school at 17, not due to any intellectual deficiency, but because his family desperately needed the income. He immediately began working full-time at Nagel & Sons Auto Repair, changing oil, painstakingly rebuilding carburetors, diagnosing transmission failures. It was honest, essential work, but hardly the stuff of heroic legend. When the news of Pearl Harbor shattered the nation, Jimmy enlisted the very next morning. The Marine Corps recruiter inquired about his skill set. "I fix engines," Jimmy replied simply. The Marine Corps assigned him to aviation mechanic school. His training totaled 6 weeks of basic instruction, radial engines, fundamental hydraulic systems, basic propeller maintenance. Jimmy finished squarely in the middle of his class. His instructor notes concluded, "Adequate technical knowledge, follows procedures correctly, not exceptional, adequate." By February 1943, Technical Sergeant Nagel found himself attached to VMF 124's essential maintenance section at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. His primary responsibility was the unglamorous, constant work of keeping the Corsairs operational. Replacing contaminated oil, patching up the inevitable bullet holes, changing worn spark plugs, it was the essential background work that silently preserved pilots' lives. Jimmy was neither an elite engineer nor a groundbreaking designer. He was certainly not brilliant in the theoretical sense. He was, however, something far more valuable in that moment, a dedicated mechanic who genuinely listened to the aviators. After grueling combat missions, when pilots returned frustrated, angry, and often heartbroken, most mechanics simply nodded politely and returned to their required task. Jimmy, however, asked detailed questions. Where exactly does the plane fight you? What specific thing happens when the turn won't hold? Show me precisely what you are doing with the control stick and rudder pedals. One specific conversation proved the catalyst for everything that followed. It was February 19, 1943. Lieutenant Howard Finn had just landed from a mission, his frustration boiling over. "The damn thing won't bite," Finn shouted, slamming his fist on the cockpit railing. I'm balls out, full stick deflection, and the nose just turns to mush. The prop is actively fighting me like I'm dragging the entire goddamn engine assembly around against its own will. Most mechanics would have dismissed the complaint instantly. That's torque, Lieutenant. It's physics, nothing we can do. Jimmy instead asked the revolutionary question, what if we could? Finn stared at the young sergeant. Could what? Reduce the torque effect, Jimmy elaborated. Make the propeller behave differently. Make it bite the air differently. How? Finn demanded. Jimmy didn't have the answer, not yet. That night, sleep proved impossible for Jimmy Nagel. His mind cycled endlessly through the problem. The propeller governor, the precision device designed to automatically adjust the blade pitch to hold the engine at its optimal RPM, was calibrated for the Corsair's entire massive flight envelope: takeoff, long-range cruise, high-speed combat, and precarious landing. This meant that the governor compromised its efficiency in every single regime just to function adequately across all of them. What if, Jimmy pondered, combat pilots didn't need adequate performance everywhere? What if they needed absolutely perfect performance during the critical turning fight? Jimmy located the voluminous technical manual for the Hamilton Standard Hydromatic Propeller. He flipped to page 47, section 8. The text was unambiguous. Governor pitch stops are preset at the factory. Any adjustment necessitates certification by qualified personnel. Unauthorized modification may result in propeller overspeed, irreparable engine damage, or catastrophic blade failure. In essence, do not touch it. Jimmy stared at the page for 60 minutes. Then his mind drifted to the fate of Lieutenant Baldwin. To the 8 pilots VMF 124 had lost in only 6 weeks, and to Finn's desperate words, the prop is fighting me. He slowly closed the manual. At 300 hours on February 20th, 1943, Jimmy Nagel walked silently to the maintenance tent. He carefully detached a spare propeller governor from a decommissioned Corsair engine. He was about to begin what the manual explicitly decreed was impossible. What he could not have known was that by the time the sun rose over Guadalcanal, he would stand in violation of 3 separate federal regulations, risking an immediate court-martial, yet simultaneously and fundamentally rewriting the tactical doctrine for how America would prosecute the air war. Henderson Field possessed no secret temperature-controlled workshops. It was dominated by red mud, swarms of mosquitoes, and a single maintenance tent, dimly illuminated by a lone, sputtering kerosene lamp. This improvised location became the laboratory for Jimmy Nagel's technical transgression. The Hamilton Standard Propeller Governor represented a pinnacle of precision engineering, oil pressure controlled, mechanically complex, and calibrated to exact tolerances, measured in thousandths of an inch. The official manual mandated that only certified, highly trained technicians with 40 hours of specific instruction were permitted to attempt adjustments. Jimmy possessed only a basic crescent wrench, a micrometer, and the invaluable, unyielding stubbornness of a Pittsburgh garage mechanic. The governor's essential function was to control blade pitch, the precise angle of the propeller blades relative to the oncoming airflow. A coarse pitch, meaning a high angle, was optimized for maximum cruising speed. A fine pitch, meaning a low angle, provided maximum thrust capability. The governor continuously automated the adjustment between these limits to maintain the engine's optimal rotational speed, RPM. However, optimal was a subjective, broad term. Vaught-Sikorsky engineers had meticulously calibrated the governor to serve a vast performance envelope. Jimmy's objective was to drastically narrow that envelope, biasing the entire system specifically toward low-speed, high-thrust operation. His target was the fine pitch stop, the small physical limit that prevented the propeller blades from flattening out too far. The manual maintained that the fine pitch setting was already optimally set for flight. Going any finer, the manual warned, would inevitably cause catastrophic propeller overspeed during the critical takeoff phase, potentially destroying the engine and the pilot. Jimmy paused. What if we willingly accepted that specific calculated risk? He carefully removed the governor's housing. Inside, he found a delicate complexity of tiny pistons, springs, and precision adjustment screws. He located the fine-pitched stop, a small, unassuming brass screw that defined the physical limit for blade flatness. He rotated it exactly 1/4 turn. He measured the resulting adjustment with the micrometer, checked the required internal clearances, and calculated the change in his head. The standard factory fine pitch setting was 23.5 degrees. Jimmy's field modification resulted in a new setting of 21.8 degrees, a physical change of 1.7 degrees. This minuscule adjustment amounted to roughly 1/16 of an inch at the propeller blade tip. The Navy manual would have labeled this adjustment catastrophic. Jimmy Nagel called it essential. He mounted the newly modified Governor onto a spare propeller hub for a bench test. He cycled pitch range repeatedly observing the blades moving through their new limits. Mechanically, everything appeared sound. But would the engine survive takeoff? Would it fly? February 21st, 1943, 600 hours, Jimmy quietly reinstalled the modified Governor unit onto Lieutenant Finn's designated Corsair. He told no one, not Finn, not the maintenance chief, not a soul. Finn started the engine for a routine test flight. The Corsair roared powerfully to life. The RPM climbed steadily, the propeller pitch adjusted automatically, everything looked perfectly normal. Finn taxied out, took off, and climbed to 5,000 feet, executing a series of basic maneuvers. He returned 20 minutes later. He climbed down from the cockpit, walked directly to Jimmy, and his voice was hushed, incredulous. "What in God's name did you do?" "What do you mean, Lieutenant?" "The plane," Finn insisted. "It's fundamentally different. It's lighter in the turns. It feels like the nose wants to follow the turn input instead of actively fighting me." Jimmy's heart was hammering against his ribs. "Is it better or is it worse?" "Better," Finn confirmed, a grin spreading across his face. "Way better. What did you change?" Jimmy began to explain the precise technical nature of the fine pitch adjustment. Finn immediately cut him off. "I don't care about the technical definitions," Finn stated, looking toward the line of waiting aircraft. "Can you do this to the entire squadron?" "It's not authorized, sir," Jimmy replied, feeling the immense weight of the regulations. "Can you do it?" Finn repeated, his voice demanding survival, not compliance. Jimmy looked down the flight line at the 19 other Corsairs. "Yeah," he said simply, "I can do it." That same afternoon, the maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Jones, discovered Jimmy modifying a second propeller Governor unit. "Sergeant Nagel, what the devil are you doing?" Jones demanded, his voice low with professional alarm. "Just the fine pitch stop," Jimmy answered, not looking up from the wrench. "That's illegal," Jones protested. "The manual explicitly prohibits that action." "I know exactly what the manual says, Chief," Jimmy stated, calmly tightening a retaining nut. "You are jeopardizing your entire career," Jones hissed. "You could potentially destroy these engines and kill a pilot if something fails." "If something goes wrong, Chief, I will accept all the blame," Jimmy responded, meeting his superior's gaze. "But pilots are dying right now because these planes won't turn, and I can fix it." The chief stared at him, his face a mask of conflict. "That's impossible, Sergeant. Engineers spent years optimizing those governors." Jimmy replied quietly, folding his hands across the manual. "Engineers don't actually fly combat missions, Chief." Master Sergeant Jones slowly walked away from the tent, silent. 2 hours later, he returned. He didn't look at Jimmy's face, only at the disassembled components on the bench. "How many of these units," he asked, his voice barely audible, "can you finish modifying by sunrise tomorrow?" "Huh?" By the morning of February 23, 1943, Jimmy Nagel had completed unauthorized modifications on 12 propeller governors. 0 pilots had logged sufficient flight hours to validate them. 0 engineers had granted approval. 0 regulations had been respected. Major William Geese, VMF 124's sharp commanding officer, discovered the clandestine operation during a mandatory routine maintenance briefing. The maintenance chief, reporting on the status of the fleet, declared, "Sir, we have implemented propeller pitch modifications on 60% of the squadron's aircraft." Geese's face instantly flushed crimson. "You did what?" he barked. "Technical Sergeant Nagel adjusted the fine pitch stops, Major," the chief explained quickly, "to significantly improve low-spin handling characteristics during combat maneuvering." "On whose specific authority was this done?" Geese demanded, his volume escalating dangerously. Silence enveloped the tent. The maintenance chief looked toward Jimmy. Jimmy rose slowly to his feet. Fine, sir, Jimmy confirmed. You are a sergeant. You possess absolutely no engineering authority. No, sir, Jimmy agreed. Do you comprehend the magnitude of what you have done, Sergeant? Gies leaned forward, his hands braced on the briefing table. Those propellers are highly calibrated instruments. One calculation error, and those blades could overspeed and throw a piece of metal straight through the cockpit. You could inadvertently kill someone. Yes, sir. And you proceeded anyway. Yes, sir, Jimmy said, holding the gaze of his commander. Gies drove directly toward Jimmy, stopping only a foot away, looking directly into his eyes. Why? Because, sir, Jimmy stated, we are losing pilots consistently in turn-in fights, and I strongly believe, that I possess a mechanical solution that can help. You think you're justified in gambling with lives? I think, sir, Jimmy said quietly, that we are already gambling with lives. 8 Corsairs down in 6 weeks. I am attempting to fundamentally improve those odds. The room erupted immediately. The squadron's engineering officer jumped to his feet, gesturing wildly. This is completely insane. You cannot simply alter propeller calibrations. You have any idea how many variables are involved? Temperature, altitude, manifold pressure, RPM stability. This is recklessness. The operations officer chimed in, equally agitated. Major, this man has compromised the structural integrity of 12 aircraft. We must ground every single one immediately, pending full inspection. Then Lieutenant Finn stepped forward, interrupting the cacophony. Sir, he announced, addressing Major Gies, I flew one of the modified aircraft yesterday. All noise ceased. Gies looked at Finn, his expression unreadable. You were aware of this illegal modification? Yes, sir, Finn replied. And sir, it flies dramatically better, significantly better. The low-speed handling has been transformed. I can maintain perfectly coordinated flight at considerably lower speeds and execute a tighter turn radius without fighting the engine torque. Sometimes the only expert you need is someone who gives a damn. The engineering officer stubbornly shook his head. Placebo effect. One single test flight proves nothing. We require systematic, controlled evaluation, controlled conditions. With all due respect, sir, Finn interjected, the tension in his voice palpable. We do not need controlled conditions. We need combat-expable aircraft that can survive a dogfight. Sergeant Nagel has provided us with exactly that. The room dissolved into shouting once more. Officers cited regulations, threatened careers, and demanded adherence to protocol. Major Gies slowly raised a calming hand. The room fell silent. Here is precisely what is going to happen, Gies announced, his voice now low and firm. Tomorrow morning, we are executing a comparative flight test. 2 Corsairs will fly, one standard configuration, one modified. Identical pilots, identical conditions. We will test turning performance at 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet, and 2,000 feet. We are going to generate hard data. I want to see which aircraft completes more rotations in 60 seconds. The engineering officer started a new protest. Sir, this unquestionably violates current Navy flight regulations. Dietz cut him off instantly. I know precisely what it violates, Lieutenant, but I have pilots who are dying, and I have a sergeant who might just have solved the single biggest problem plaguing this airframe. We are testing it. End of discussion. He turned his full attention back to Jimmy. Sergeant Nagel, if this modification works, you are instantly a hero. If it does not, if a single man crashes because of your unauthorized modification, you are going to prison. Are we absolutely clear on the stakes? Yes, sir, Jimmy confirmed. Then get out of my sight. Go get some sleep. That night, Jimmy found sleep impossible. He meticulously reran his calculations in his head, checking his precise measurements, second-guessing every tiny factor involved. What if the blades did overspeed? What if the structural integrity was compromised just enough to cause a catastrophic failure? Around 200 hours, Lieutenant Finn found him alone in the maintenance tent, hunched over the workbench, staring intensely at a disassembled propeller governor. You okay, Jimmy? What if I'm wrong, Lieutenant? Jimmy whispered, articulating his greatest fear. What if the blades overspeed and they throw the engine casing apart? Then we handle it, Finn said, pulling up a box to sit down. But I've flown your modification. I know it works. Home flight doesn't prove engineering validity. Jimmy, listen to me, Finn interrupted, his voice dropping to a serious tone. In the last 6 weeks, we have lost 8 guys, good guys, my friends, and every single one of them died in a turning fight because the Corsair refused to perform when they needed it most. You fix that. I couldn't care less about the bureaucratic regulations. You gave us back a fighting chance to survive. Jimmy looked up at him, fatigue evident in his eyes. What if Major Geese reports me directly to Bouar? Finn smiled, a genuine tired smile. Then we'll both be sitting in the brig together. Now go get some rest. Tomorrow morning you are going to prove every one of those pencil-pushing engineers completely wrong. February 24th, 1943, 800 hours. 2 immaculate F4U Corsairs sat lined up on the dusty temporary runway at Henderson Field. Lieutenant Finn was seated in the aircraft bearing the modified propeller governor. Lieutenant Walsh was in the standard factory configuration aircraft. Major Geese stood upon the control tower roof, stopwatch in hand, clipboard ready. Gentlemen, he radioed, his voice sharp with anticipation, you are cleared for the comparative flight test. Climb to 10,000 feet, perform maximum rate, level turns until I call terminate. I want to quantify which aircraft completes the highest number of rotations in exactly 60 seconds. Report when ready. Both pilots acknowledged the order. The Corsairs roared down the runway and lifted off into the bright morning sunlight. 12 tense minutes later, the radio crackled with Lieutenant Walsh's voice, thick with strain. Major, this is Walsh. Sir, I cannot maintain the pace with Finn. He is completing his turns inside my radius by at least 50 feet. I am at maximum performance, full deflection, and he is flying measurable circles around me. Finn's voice follows, sounding exhilarated. Sir, this aircraft is night and day different. The control authority is drastically improved. Major Geese lowered his clipboard and looked directly at the engineering officer standing next to him. Ground the standard configuration aircraft immediately, he commanded. Sergeant Nagel, you now have precisely 24 hours to modify every single propeller in this entire squadron. The engineering officer began to formulate a protest, citing regulations. Geese silenced him with a stare. That, the major stated firmly, is a direct order. The data rigorously gathered from VMF 124's modified Corsairs fundamentally rewrote the established textbook on fighter performance. Over 21 consecutive days of systematic testing between February 25th and March 15th, 1943, the numbers proved utterly undeniable. The standard Corsair, operating with the 23.5-degree fine pitch setting, yielded a minimum sustained turn radius of 890 feet. The maximum G load achievable before the loss of coordinated control was 4.8 Gs. The stall speed during a coordinated turn sat at 127 miles per hour. The pilot workload required to counter the relentless engine torque translated to a pedal force of 65 pounds. The modified Corsair, operating with Nagel's 21.8-degree fine-pitch setting, achieved a minimum sustained turn radius of 710 feet. The maximum G-load before control loss jumped significantly to 5.9 Gs. The stall speed in a coordinated turn dropped to 114 miles per hour. Critically, the pilot workload needed to counter the torque plummeted to only 38 pounds of pedal force. The improvement was staggering, a reduction of 180 feet in sustained turn radius. This made the Corsair 20% tighter. Against the Zero's radius of 630 feet, the Corsair was still not perfectly equal, but the gap had been closed enough to be lethal. Crucially, pilots could now aggressively sustain these turns without being forced to physically fight their own aircraft's inherent design flaws. The massive reduction in necessary torque counterforce meant they could finally focus 100% on tactical maneuver instead of desperately wrestling with unyielding physics. The response from the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics was immediate, predictable, and hostile. A sharp telegram reached Major Geese on March 3, 1943. Unauthorized propeller modifications constitute a serious violation of BUAR Directive 143B. Cease all operational flights immediately. All modified aircraft must be grounded pending full inspection. Responsible personnel are subject to immediate court-martial proceedings. Geese's brief, sharp response was transmitted moments later. Negative. Combat operations will continue. Modified aircraft demonstrate provably superior performance in combat simulations. Respectfully request BUAR engineers travel to the field and observe combat testing before issuing further directives. The ensuing bureaucratic confrontation lasted 11 grueling days. Engineers argued endlessly about theoretical safety margins. Pilots argued passionately about real-world survival. Major Geese stubbornly refused to recall the modified aircraft. And the ultimate deciding voice arrived from an unexpected figure, Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, a respected Navy test pilot who also happened to be a former aeronautical engineer. Blackburn flew directly to Guadalcanal with the specific mission of personally evaluating the controversial modification. On March 12, 1943, Blackburn spent 6 hours in the air flying both standard and Nagel modified Corsairs. He pushed both airframes to their absolute physical limits, executing every test maneuver in the official flight manual. His report, submitted immediately to the Bureau, was a definitive judgment. Technical Sergeant Nagel's modification represents empirical field engineering of the highest caliber. The adjusted fine pitch setting significantly enhances low-speed maneuver authority without compromising high-speed performance, stability, or established safety margins. I recommend immediate fleet-wide adoption. The Bureau of Aeronautics finally granted its official approval on March 14, 1943, but by that time, the aviators of VMF 124 had already validated the modification in the only laboratory that truly mattered, active combat. February 28, 1943, 1,400 hours, 18,000 feet above the island of Bougainville. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying one of the new modified Corsairs, led a flight of 8 fighters. They were escorting SBD Dauntless dive bombers tasked with assaulting Japanese defensive positions at Kahili. The radio suddenly exploded. "Bandits! 6 of them! 3 o'clock high!" Walsh immediately hauled the stick hard right, full control, input. The Corsair responded with an astonishing new immediacy, the nose snapping around cleanly. The turn was perfectly coordinated. There was no torque fight, no wrestling required. The enemy Zero dropped into a diving turn, seeking to press its advantage. Walsh maneuvered instantly to intercept the Zero's path. Both aircraft locked into a sustained turning engagement at 12,000 feet. What unfolded next was completely unprecedented in the Pacific theater. The heavier Corsair stayed with the Zero. Turn for turn, it was not perfectly matched, but it was incredibly close. So tight, in fact, that the agile Japanese pilot could not successfully widen the turn circle enough to line up a killing shot. Walsh aggressively applied power. The modified propeller bit fiercely into the air, efficiently converting engine thrust directly into turning force. The Corsair's nose nudged just barely inside the Zero's flight path. Just barely. Walsh fired. 50 caliber rounds ripped through the Zero's engine cowling. The enemy aircraft detonated. Kill 1 for Walsh. But he was not finished. A second Zero screamed in, attacking from below. Walsh reacted instantly, rolling his aircraft inverted, pulling through the maneuver, and immediately entering a second turning engagement at 8,000 feet. Again, the Corsair held the turn perfectly. The Zero pilot could not shake him loose. The Japanese flyer executed every maneuver in his playbook: reversals, climbs, desperate breaks. Walsh remained glued to his tail. 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds of relentless, sustained turning combat. Walsh fired again. The Zero disintegrated into debris. 2 turning kills secured in a single mission, an outcome deemed mathematically impossible just days earlier. Walsh landed back at Henderson Field, shut down the engine, and remained sitting in the cockpit for a full, silent minute, processing the impossible reality. When he finally climbed out, Jimmy Nagel was waiting near the edge of the flight line. Walsh walked straight up to him, said nothing, but simply extended his hand in silence. Jimmy shook it. Walsh spoke, his voice low and solemn. "You saved my life today, Sergeant." The aggregated combat statistics for March and April 1943 told the definitive story. VMF 124, flying the Nagel-modified Corsairs, logged 342 sorties, claiming 67 aerial victories against only 3 losses, a phenomenal kill ratio of 22-1. BMF 2013 flying standard configuration Corsairs during the same period logged 298 sorties, claiming 41 victories against 7 losses. Their kill ratio, 6-1. The aircraft equipped with the forbidden modification were nearly 4 times more lethal in the air. How did these young pilots face an impossible scenario and turn the tide? Japanese after-action reports quickly began to document the frightening change. A captured intelligence document dated April 1943 noted, American F4U Corsair fighters now exhibit significantly improved low-span maneuverability. Our previous tactical advantage in turning engagements has sharply diminished. Recommend immediate avoidance of prolonged dogfights. Use speed tactics only. Saburo Sakai, the Japanese legend, recorded the chilling realization in his diary after a disastrous encounter with modified Corsairs on April 11, 1943. The American fighters have fundamentally changed. They now turn nearly as effectively as our Zeros, yet they strike with tremendously greater force. Our essential advantage is rapidly disappearing. The Americans are either learning rapidly or perhaps they have discovered something critical that we completely missed. What they had found was simply a talented Pittsburgh garage mechanic named Jimmy Nagel. By June 1943, every single Corsair squadron operating in the vast Pacific theater had adopted the modification. Vought engineers eventually integrated the adjusted pitch setting into the official production specification. Every Corsair constructed after July 1943 left the factory floor with Nagel's illegal modification as a standard required component. The total number of lives preserved is inherently impossible to calculate with scientific precision, but the raw numbers offer a compelling suggestion of the answer. Pre-modification, February 12 to 24, 1943, Corsair combat losses per 100 sorties stood at 2.3. Pilot survival rate when forced into turning combat was a grim 41%. Post-modification, February 21st, December 31, 1943, plummeted to 0.6. Pilot survival rate soared to 78%. Over the span of the Pacific War from 1943 to 1945, Corsairs executed 64,051 combat sorties. The improved survival metrics suggest that approximately 1,100 fewer pilots were killed or declared missing in action, 1,100 men who ultimately came home because one mechanic demonstrated the courage to break established rules. James Nagel never sought or desired formal recognition. When the war concluded in 1945, Jimmy quietly returned to Pittsburgh, reopened his father's auto garage, resumed fixing cars, changing oil, and lived a meticulously quiet life. He never filed for patents, never sought royalties, and never wrote memoirs detailing his wartime contribution. When journalists eventually located and tracked him down in the 1960s, seeking interviews about the revolutionary Corsair modification, his standard response was always the same, marked by profound humility. I just did my job. The pilots are the true heroes. In 1972, a researcher representing the Smithsonian Institution contacted him, requesting a donation of materials for a major Pacific War aviation exhibit. Jimmy politely declined via letter. I do not possess anything remotely worth displaying, he wrote. The pilots were the heroes. I just turned wrenches. The specific modified propeller governor that he had first adjusted, the device that changed everything, had been installed in Lieutenant Finn's Corsair. That specific aircraft was tragically shot down over Rabaul in September 1943. That original propeller assembly now lies somewhere at the bottom of the deep Pacific Ocean, but the modification itself achieved immortality. By the cessation of World War II, Vought had manufactured 12,571 Corsairs. Every single one incorporated the now standard Nagel pitch adjustment. The final official production specification listed the requirement, Hamilton Standard Governor fine pitch stop 21.8 degrees. There was never any formal mention of who had definitively discovered that setting. No credit line was ever given. The Corsair's final astonishing combat statistics, 2,140 aerial victories against 189 total losses, yielding an 11-1 kill ratio, the lowest loss rate achieved by any American fighter deployed in the Pacific War. How much of that monumental success can be directly attributed to Technical Sergeant Nagel's unauthorized adjustment? It remains impossible to precisely quantify, but the pilots who survived knew the answer instinctively. Following the war, VMF 124 instituted annual squadron reunions. Every year they invited Jimmy Nagel, and every single year he politely declined the invitation, preferring anonymity. Finally, in 1978, the surviving members of the squadron sent a small, determined delegation directly to his unassuming garage in Pittsburgh. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh, retired, now wearing the Congressional Medal of Honor, walked into Nagel and Sons Auto Repair. Jimmy looked up from a Chevrolet engine he was dismantling. "Can I help you, Colonel?" Jimmy asked. Walsh simply smiled. "Jimmy, you already did." The reunion that year was hosted right there in Pittsburgh. 57 former Corsair pilots attended. They presented Jimmy with a single, simple plaque: to Technical Sergeant James Nagel, whose unauthorized ingenuity and willingness to break rules saved lives, won battles, and proved that the best engineering sometimes comes from a mechanic with a wrench and the courage to question authority. Jimmy hung the plaque not in the public waiting area, but in his small private back office. He never displayed it publicly. He died in 1993 at the age of 73. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was 3 sentences long, mentioning only that he was a veteran. It completely failed to mention the Corsairs. Yet, inside the Marine Corps Aviation Museum at Quantico, Virginia, there exists a detailed exhibit dedicated to the F4U Corsair's development. One small, specific panel describes the evolution of its propeller systems. At the very bottom, in small print, is the following notation: field adjustment pioneered by TSGT James P. Nagel, USMC, 1943. Modern fighter aircraft today still rely upon sophisticated variable pitch propeller systems. The core principles Nagel discovered, optimizing pitch settings for intensely specific combat regimes rather than compromising for general performance, are now universally accepted standard doctrine in high-level aerospace engineering programs. Boeing engineers study his field modification in specialized propulsion courses, not because the modification was mechanically complex, but because it was elegantly simple, necessary, and undeniably effective. The true moral lesson of this historical event is not ultimately about propellers or aerodynamics. It is about the absolute necessity of questioning established authority when human lives hang in the balance. It is about trusting the empirical judgment of the individuals who actually perform the job, not solely the educated people with advanced degrees and fixed ideas. It is about finding the profound courage to shatter established rules for the right, necessary reasons. The formal engineers declared the modification impossible. The Navy regulations declared it strictly illegal, but the combat pilots themselves declared that it saved their lives. Sometimes the only technical expert the world needs is an ordinary person who gives an extraordinary damn. A mechanic's quiet courage changed the outcome of the Pacific War. If this story about technical ingenuity and the struggle against bureaucracy resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to BTB Stories for more deep dives into forgotten history. Thank you for watching.